My name is Loy Dickinson. I was born and raised in Berkeley, California, and went all through the school system there up until I graduated from high school in February. Actually, it was a midwinter class in 1943. And 2 months later, I was in the service. I was inducted at the Monterey Presidio, and there I took a battery of tests like everybody else to become a PFC, and they wanted to know what my interests or preferences would be. And I suggested that I'd like to get into the Japanese language school in intelligence. And they told me that this would be possible, but I would have to wait 10 months for the next opening, and in the meantime I could go to Camp Cook. What is Camp Cook? That's the infantry. I said, what are my other choices? But I have to back up and tell you that the reason for my interest was my high school girlfriend, Barbara Topping, had been born in Japan. Her parents were Baptist missionaries, and they had been brought back early because they knew that trouble was coming, and so this was kind of tickled my interest. But her father was a teacher at one of the two intelligence schools. One was at Berkeley and the other was at Harvard. And all of the instructors, with a few exceptions, were Japanese. And you may recall that the Japanese were relocated, shall we say, into camps in the spring of 42. Anyway, back to my preference for the Air Corps. I was sent to the Santa Ana pre-flight for a 16-week program, and we had all of the regular training routines that you go through and learning military ways. And the thing about Santa Ana was that it was in Southern California, which is close to where there are a lot of attractions, and young folks from all over the West were there, and we were not allowed to go out for the first 8 weeks, so we did get a chance to go out for a weekend after that. But then from there, I beg your pardon, while I'm at Santa Ana, I also did further testing, and they discovered or concluded that I did not qualify for either pilot or bombardier training because of my visual acuity. And so, but I could qualify as a navigator candidate, which means I would get a desk job, you see. And then from there I went to McClellan Air Force Base in Las Vegas for gunnery training. I was a 6-week training in the 50 caliber machine gun, and we did some flying and shooting at targets that were trailed along behind an airplane that was pulling them. One of the fun things about it that I remember was that we did practice skeet shooting. They shoot a clay bird out, and you track it with your rifle and try to shoot it down. Then from there I went to Hondo, Texas, which is about 70 miles west of San Antonio. It was one of the half dozen or so places where they had navigation training for candidates. The program there lasted about 16 weeks, as I remember, and I did graduate in the class of 4. They call us 44-4, which was a 4th class, and it was actually about the end of March of 1944. My classmates were all sent on their way, and I didn't get my commission immediately because they wanted to take my tonsils out before, so I had to go in the hospital and have my tonsils removed before I'd get my commission. I remember going into Randolph Field in San Antonio with the paperwork that I needed to. I presented it to a clerk at one of the counters and went through the process, and they handed it back to me. And of course I had my bars in my pocket. I couldn't put them on until I was officially an officer. And so when I went out on the street, first enlisted man I ran into saluted me, and he was surprised when I handed him a dollar bill, because that was kind of the tradition for a newly officered person. From there I went to Plant Park at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida, to meet up with the crew. And in the process of doing that, one of my fellow classmates, Bob St. Germain, who lived in Helena, Montana, or was from Montana, and we made a stop in New Orleans and visited the campus of what was then the girls' school. It's part of Tulane now, and I'll think of it in a minute. But anyway, we met some lovely young ladies there, and they were very kind and generous and invited us to their home for dinner with their families. And matter of fact, I struck up an acquaintance with one of them and maintained that, and still to this day we still exchange Christmas cards and notes about the family. Dolores Kelly is her name. The camp, I beg your pardon, the facility, the field that we were at was where the crew training was taking place for crews that were being prepared to go overseas into combat. And the crew that I joined was Bill Garland, was a pilot. And their navigator, a fellow named Vic Janowitz, was of the Jewish persuasion, and he had gone to the commandant and requested to be transferred to the Pacific Theater because he didn't think his chances were too good to be flying over Germany with taking a chance in being shot down and treated badly. And so when I joined the crew, they had pretty much completed all of their other training missions, and so the intensity was focused on just those missions that required, or were navigation missions, you might say. And so we did, night flying and worked with the sextant, and we used an E6B computer, which is a little device. I wish I had one to show you, but it's actually kind of a slide rule that was developed in 1927 and still in use today by pilots, because it allows you to measure wind drift and airspeed and all that sort of thing by manipulating the slide rule. And it was a very handy little device. On one of the training missions that we took was to fly across the Gulf of Mexico to St. Charles, Louisiana, Lake Charles, Louisiana. And on that particular flight, we had a Czech pilot with us. He happened to be a major, and he was checking the entire crew, the pilot, the bombardier, the navigator. And when we were approaching the coast of Louisiana, he came down into the navigator section where I am, which is below to the left of the pilot, and wanted to check my readings and what I thought was the line that we were going to cross the coastline, and I showed him where I thought that was, and he said, I think you might be over here, a little off of that line. And fortunately, we crossed over the line that I had navigated or concluded, and so I passed that kind of a test.
Let me interrupt just
Go ahead.
I don't think we're clear on what kind of airplane you're flying or anything like that. You wanna...
Right. I should have mentioned, yeah, we were being trained in a B-17 aircraft, which is, of course, known as the Flying Fortress. And when we finished that phase and we're ready to go overseas, we were taken by train to Savannah, Georgia, where we picked up a brand new B-17 that we flew across the Atlantic. This was the latter part of end of June, so it was a summer season, you might say. And so we flew north to Bangor, Maine, and this every day was a different destination. The second day we flew to Gander, Newfoundland, and from there to San Miguel in the Azores Islands, and from there to Marrakesh, North Africa, and from Marrakesh to Tunis, Tunisia. And then on the sixth day, we flew into Foggia, Italy, which is in the southern part of the country on the Adriatic side, near where the heel of the spur is, or the spur would be. And it's that was a 6-day journey. Of course, it'd be a matter of hours to fly that same route today's world. One of the interesting things that happened on that trip was that when we landed in the Azores, it was literally a gas can, and the Brits were in charge of the whole thing. And it happened to be on 4th of July. And some of the Americans decided it was time to celebrate the 4th of July, and so they were shooting off Very pistols, which are flare-type guns that are used to show your position or something of the sort. And of course the Brits went bananas because they could see the whole island being blown up with a gasoline fire, because they were providing fuel for the refueling of the aircraft that were flying through. We didn't cause a disaster, of course. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. When we got into Foggia, we were based at a place called Amendola. The American and the Allied forces had run in or landed and took possession of parts of southern Italy in September of 43. And by December, they had cleared enough of the area out so that they were able to take over German air bases that had already been established, the German air bases there, and those became bases for B-17s and B-24s, plus the fighter aircraft. We had P-38s and P-51s and some 47s, P-47 fighter aircraft. They were based in perhaps a dozen different airfields around that Foggia area. The bomb group was originally based in North Africa, pardon me, and in December of 43, as I mentioned before, they had moved from North Africa to the base in Italy, and we came in July. In February of 44, they had a major loss of aircraft. I think they had lost a total of 14 airplanes out of the group, and about 25 or 26 men were killed, and the rest were, most of them ended up POWs.
We're going to be talking with the B-24 navigator coming in.
Oh, okay.
Part of this show as well. There's a rivalry between the B-17 guys and the B-24 guys, isn't there?
Oh yeah, just what do you call it? Our outfit or our airplane is better than yours, and we were called the Flying Fortress, and the B-24 was the Flying Boxcar, the Fire Trap. We called them a Fire Trap or something. I never did take any of that too seriously. It was just, that's the normal competitive spirit that you get into.
The tools you were using were essentially the same as far as navigation goes, but were there any other differences between, was it better to be in a 17 or a 24 for the kind of missions that you were in?
I think the main, I would say, regarding the difference between the two, when we flew high altitude missions, the B-17s normally were able to fly higher than the B-24 for some reason or other. In other words, they had a greater capacity for flying at higher altitude. I think maybe the B-24 may have been faster, but not by, 5 or 10 miles an hour doesn't make much difference when the fighters are flying twice that speed. Yeah. We were now part of the 15th Air Force, and we were assigned to the 2nd Bombardment Group. And the 2nd has a very interesting history because it was originally formed in September of 1918, the oldest heavy bombardment unit in the military. And we were in the 20th Squadron. There were 4 squadrons in a group, and we happened to have a total of 5 B-17 groups in the Air Force, and there were 14 B-24 groups. So that kind of tells you what the ratio of 17s and 24s was. We arrived at the base on the 7th July, and I didn't fly my first mission until July the 18th. And that happened to be over a target in Romania called Ploiești, which is famous for being the point where they refine and move the oil and gasoline up the Danube to feed the German war machine. So it was a very heavily bombed target and one that was heavily defended. So it was a very, very interesting exposure. I flew that mission, and then over the next month, I was on a total of 3 missions over Ploiești, and the 15th bombed Ploiești almost every time that the weather was clear for that kind of an attack. So it was a pretty intensely targeted project. On other missions, there was one. I should tell a story about July 25th. This is about my 4th or 5th mission. We were assigned to attack an assembly plant and assembled fighter planes in a place called Linz, Austria, which is west of Vienna. And on the route to the target, the lead plane had developed some mechanical problems, and so the pilot waggled his wings to signal that they were in distress and pulled out of the formation, and the number 2 aircraft pulled up to take its place, and the lead bombardier was instructed to toggle his bombs so that they would be able to keep up with the rest of the formation. And in that act, a dozen or so alert bombardiers figured they were over the target, so they toggled their bombs too. Well, we raised hell with a field of cotton or corn or whatever it was. Did absolutely no damage to the German war machine. However, I want to reassure everybody that we did finally win the war. On another occasion, this is August the 15th, and by this time I think I was about my 16th or 17th mission. We supported the invasion of southern France, and the goal then was to fly in over the target and drop your bombs before 7 a.m. in the morning, because the invasion was scheduled and did take place at 7:30. This meant that we had to take off in the dark, and American crews, unlike the British, didn't do any night flying. When you take off from the airfield in the dark, how do you form up? Well, we did it kind of by seat of the pants. We have, as I mentioned before, 4 squadrons. Each squadron has 7 aircraft, and a total of 28 in a group. And when we took off and headed out across the Mediterranean, we were only able to count for about a dozen or 12 or 13 that belonged to our outfit, but we picked up some other stragglers, and we did get over the target and drop our bombs. But there was another one of those instances where lack of prior training got in the way of being really successful. But another thing about that invasion was that in the process of preparing to go into the combat area, the gunners would always shoot several rounds of ammunition to test their firearms or test their guns. On this occasion, we could not do it because the Mediterranean was literally loaded with thousands of various kinds of ships and boats and fighter, equipment that was supporting or taking part in the invasion. But that was one of those times.
We have something we're doing upcoming with the Tuskegee Airmen, which flew out of Southern Europe. Did you ever have any experiences with the Tuskegee Airmen as fighter escorts or protecting you in any way?
We did have the red tails, is what they called them, I think, wasn't it? And I wasn't aware of it at the time, but I learned since that we did have fighter cover from the Tuskegee Airmen. I forget the name of the number of the outfit, 352 or something of the sort. But we did have that experience, and I wasn't aware of it at the time.
Okay.
I've met some of them since, but yeah.
Oh, kind of describe that a little bit. Have you been able to relate anything at all about your experiences to them and talking back and forth about?
Just in the normal exchange of your own experiences. Yeah, we couldn't relate. I mean, we couldn't relate to one doing anything for the other, but we had that in common. That was the main thing. Yeah. Good guys. I guess the thing that I should say about the combat missions, we had pretty clear air superiority for the most part, and so we didn't see aircraft too often. But we did in almost every target we went to, particularly Ploesti, were greeted by very, very heavy flak fire. Flak is a little ball of metal that's pounded together to make similar to the size of a softball, and they're shot from guns that I couldn't begin to describe, but they were very clever in how they worked it, because they were able to throw fire up and have it detonate or explode when it reached a certain altitude. And if they could tell that they were too low or too high, they could adjust until they found our altitude. And then when these things exploded, we were flying in an aluminum covered vehicle. I mean, an airplane. And so there was almost the slightest thing that hit the airplane would penetrate. So we almost always came away with a lot of flak damage, and sometimes it wouldn't do any harm to speak of to the aircraft or to the occupants or the flyers, but oftentimes it did. We had one occasion when we had a waist gunner who had a badly injured left arm, which he took with him after. I mean, he stayed with him after the war. He wasn't able to ever get it completely rehabilitated. But on those occasions, we also came back, and part of the reporting that you do is the kind of resistance you met, and whether it was heavy, medium, or light flak and so forth. On one occasion, when we came back, the wheels are let down so that we can land, and everything is fine. The bombardier and I are sitting in the nose, and when the plane hit the ground, the right tire blew out. It had been damaged by flak, and so this caused the plane to pull to the right, and there was a row of airplanes alongside the runway, and the pilot and the co-pilot were able to steer it so that it missed those aircraft. Otherwise, the bombardier and I were shall we say, in a state of panic, because we could see this coming up. But that was one of those occasions that you're not likely to forget soon. The big day for me and our group came on August the 29th. And our mission, the one that I refer to, was number 263. The group flew a total of 412 missions from April of 43 until May 1st of 1945. And our house happened to be number 263. On that mission, we lost 9 aircraft, and I happened to be, or our squadron, I was squadron navigator by this time, and we were tail end Charlie. In other words, the 4 squadrons in the group, we were the 4th, we were in the back. And they got all 7 of our aircraft in that squadron, and 2 others. So a total of 9. There were 10 men to a crew. So we had 90 men shot down that day. Of the 90, 40 were killed, and 50 of us survived. One of the chaps was he was a radio operator on the crew that I flew with, was taken in by a Czech family and hidden out for the balance of the war. And 3 others were picked up by Slovak partisans, and eventually, about 3 weeks later, were picked up by B-17s that flew in an OSS mission, and they had taken with them about 20 Americans and Brits who had been harbored by the Slovak partisans. This took place on, matter of fact, the raid that we were on that day was to a target in the northern part of Czechoslovakia called Morava Ostrava. It's almost directly north of Bratislava. Bratislava is about 40 miles east of Vienna. And we were attacked by aircraft because they had spies out at a distance, and they could radio to their own forces where the pigeons were, you might say. There was a full Air Force program that day. We had 390 bombers in the attack. Some of them peeled off to go to other targets to distract them, but we were in the main force, and the protection, the fighter protection, was stretched out over a distance of about 60 miles, trying to cover the whole group. And that was the sad part of the mission, because we didn't have close enough fighter cover, and so we became literally the tail end Charlie group that was shot down. Part of the problem for me was that the bombardier, in the same compartment with me, was killed almost instantly, and I have no recollection of it. Everything I know about that I've learned from the other fellows since, and I didn't remember anything from the time we started the mission until later that day, when I was picked up taken in by a young Czech. Well, I'll tell you about later. So, when the part of the story that I'm telling you now has to do with what had been told me by the fellows that were on the crew. The pilot and the co-pilot were both injured quite seriously when the oxygen tank exploded right between them, and they had leg and back injuries. The top engineer, Tom Coogan, and I got them out of their seats and literally dragged them to the bomb bay and hooked their parachutes. Everybody had a pack. You wore a harness, but you didn't put your parachute on until you needed it. So we put parachutes on them and literally after Coogan had opened the bomb bay doors and dropped the bombs, we pushed him headfirst out the bomb bay doors. The Flynn and the pilot Bill Toon and the co-pilot Fran Flynn both told us later that they were thankful that we had pushed them out headfirst, because some people have been maybe pushed out feet first. They're not in control of their own bodies, and they might bang their head against the fuselage on their way out. But they did. The pilot did get an additional leg injury from the getting out of the airplane, and but they were both semi-conscious, but they came to with the rush of air that they had, and they were able to successfully land. I guess the only thing I do remember was that it was a very, very quiet experience. I mean, it's one of those things where you're suspended in air and you don't, everything is silence, it's deafening silence. That's the only thing I do remember about it. I did come down in a plowed field. My mother told me, not to get hurt when you're over there, and so I was very careful.
Was your crew together, or were they scattered all over the place when you came down?
Yeah, there were, as I mentioned, there were 90 guys shot down that day. 50 survived, and there were parachutes all over. I should mention that one of the aircraft had stayed aloft and didn't crash until they got back south of Budapest, Hungary, and they all survived. They crash landed. In other words, that was one that actually was able to land. They threw off all the gear and whatnot. Matter of fact, one of the survivors, Paul Sumner, still lives here in Denver. He's 91 or 92 years old now. But where else was that question going?
Oh, just the fact that
Yeah.
Was your crew scattered around? Did you ever see any of them again when you got to the prison camp, or were they taken to other places?
I saw Garland and Zupan and my original crew, Bombardier Novak. I never did see pilot Toon or co-pilot Flynn again because they were both in the hospital. Flynn was in the hospital until the war was over. Toon was able to move to the camp after about 3 months, but I never saw him again. Matter of fact, I didn't realize that they were even still alive until 1994, when we went back to visit for the 50th commemoration of our being shot down. Bill Toon is a retired architect and lives in Florence, Alabama, and he's still doing fine. He's about 87 years old. The co-pilot, Fran, he passed away 2 or 3 years ago. He lived in Dunkirk, New York. That reminds me I need to separate my crews. I told you originally about being on the Garland crew. Well, Bill Garland was a pilot, and Leo Zupan was a co-pilot. And that was a crew that I trained with and flew overseas with, and I flew my early missions with. And as I mentioned earlier, I had, by the middle of August, I'd been made squadron navigator, so I started flying with the lead crew. It wasn't always the same crew, but I had flown with Bill Toon 3 or 4 times, and he was also one of the lead pilots. But the crew was made up from other crews. In other words, it was not a crew that had come together, and so we didn't know each other for the most part, and I didn't. And there were a couple of them I'd never flown with before, but I do still have had a close relationship with that original Garland crew, and we had a couple of occasions to have reunions of a sort. The last time we did one was in 1982 in Sedona, Arizona, where Bill Garland lives, and he hosted the fellows and their wives. By that time, there were just 6 of us left, because in the raid, we lost the bombardier and the ball turret gunner. They were killed and never got out of the aircraft. Their bodies, of course, were recovered later. But anyway, when I did land, I took my parachute off and found my way into the woods, because I didn't know what I was going to do next. Maybe I'll bury the parachute so I wouldn't attract attention. But a young man by the name of Moimer Bacha found me. It turns out, well, he's 6 months or 7 months older than me, and he still is, by the way, and lives in Czechoslovakia. Well, he lives in what's now the Czech Republic, in Moravia. We were very close to where the current border is between the Czech Republic and the Slovakia. But they were in Moravia, which is part of the Czech Republic. And Bacha family farm was not far from where I parachuted. And he found me in the woods, and we couldn't communicate because he didn't know my language, I didn't know his. But by sign language, he let me know that he would come back for me after dark and take me to their family farm. And of course, when I was taken in to the house, that's the first time, the farmhouse. That's kind of the beginning of the recollection that I do have. And they put me up in a loft, and when it was, of course, at nighttime, and some of the locals clambered up into the loft to look at this Amerikansky flyer. One of them had a kind of a broken English, wanted to know about the gangsters in Chicago. and to tell him I didn't really know too much about Chicago because I'd only been there once in my life. So, but then the next day, they knew, and I knew, that they were in trouble, because the Germans, they're out with hunting for all these Americans that had been shot down, and so they were in danger of being treated rather badly if they were harboring a flyer. So I had to skedaddle, and I did. I had an escape kit. It was part of the gear that you got whenever you went on a mission. And my memory tells me that it included a morphine syringe in case you needed to use it, and some other odds and ends, including 8 $5 American bills. I guess you could use those to buy a taxi with or something, I don't know. Anyway, one of the other things was a map. And mine turned out to be a lovely map of Germany, which didn't do me an awful lot of good there, but it really wasn't going to be necessary because I was going to be conducted on my own tour, you might say. So I got into near the town of Slavicin, which was a short, maybe 2 miles away from where I'd been put up for that night. And I was greeted by an elderly policeman. He must have, was an old rascal. Maybe he was 50 or 60 years old.
When you were in Czechoslovakia, you spent the first night or so with this friend of yours.
One night, yeah. Mm-hmm.
You spent one night, and then you were taken to another town. I'm not entirely sure if you addressed how the Germans found you once you got there.
Just to clarify that point, when I was at the police station, the Germans, they I guess they had summoned they had told the Germans that they had an American in tow, and they came and got me and took me to their own little compound near the hospital that I mentioned. Did I make that clear before?
So the Germans essentially, or the Czechs essentially turned you into the Germans.
Yes.
They didn't
right.
try to hide you. There wasn't an underground or resistance.
There was none of that. The Czechs were totally subjugated. The place was run by the Germans. They were in charge of the whole thing. They were subjugated from 39 until 45. And then again in February of 1948, the commies took over. I've done my diversion, you might say. I've got, when I was taken in by the police, they took me to the police station, which there were half a dozen men there in different kinds of uniforms, and they questioned me. They wanted to know, did I have a pistola? No pistola. How do you fight a war without a pistol? They didn't quite understand why I didn't have a gun. There was more danger to myself if I had one. And how old I was? 19. I was 19. I was 19. They're flying babies in the war, I was one of the younger members of the crew, obviously. And but then from there a German detachment came and picked me up, just two or three guys, and took me to a little cell. There was a cell arrangement connected to a hospital in this little town. And I spent the night there. I did remember the dinner was a bowl of soup. It was probably one of the most delicious meals I had in my life. It was a magnificent feast to have a bowl of soup. But we'd taken from there by bus to Brno, and from Brno we took a train to Vienna. By this time there were maybe a dozen or so guys, and when we got to Vienna we were joined by even more, and we were taken there directly to Frankfurt am Main, where there was a interrogation facility, and they interrogated all Air Force or Air Corps personnel. And I was in solitary confinement for 6 days and nights, and I was interrogated, I guess the second day, and I didn't really have to be too evasive because the kinds of questions they asked I didn't know the answer to anyway. But they were, but it was the name, rank, and serial number type of thing. The second time was about the fourth or fifth day, and I went back to the same interrogator, who was a very good. I mean, he had very good control of the language. He claimed at one time he'd been in the lumber business in Memphis, Tennessee, and but in the second interview, he did all the talking. He told about all what happened to all the other crews and where some of them were, and our crew had been scheduled to take a leave to Capri the following week, and he wanted me to know that Captain Shepard and his crew had taken our place on that leave. They had a wire. They knew what was going on. But I also had the notion that they knew that they were in a losing cause. I mean, they didn't. I get that maybe the body language told me that, or I remember it that way anyway. They were doing their job, but they were also just going through the motions. But of course, the war was still far from being over. This was now in early September. It was the 29th of August when we were shot down. From this camp, we went to another place called Wetzlar, which was a dulag. And the dulag was set up to kind of clear people, to make sure that they were who they said they were. I mean, they wanted to know that whether you really were a flyer, whether you needed clothing or medical care, things of that sort. And I'm pretty sure most of the equipment that they had there was United States government equipment. In other words, they would restock our needs that way, but it wasn't German equipment; it was United States equipment. And from there, we went by train to the camp that I was in, which was Stalag Luft No. 1, and that was at Barth, Germany, almost directly north of Berlin. and quite close, on a clear day, we could see the Baltic Sea. And it was one of the oldest camps. The first residents there were Brits who had been captured at Dunkirk in May of 1940. The camp we were in at first was all flying officers. They were mostly Americans, Brits, South Africans, New Zealanders, Australians, Canadians, a few Belgians, even a couple of Frenchmen. But at the end of the war, there were about 9,000 men in that camp. About 7,500 were American, and the rest were other nationalities. And also because of the way that the war was proceeding, they kept moving prisoners from out of the East Germany and the Polish areas closer in, and they began to bring enlisted men into the camps. And these, we didn't see very much of them because they had added more compounds. They had this first compound later became known as South Compound. When they built the second one, it became North. By the time I got to the camp, we were in North number 2. And this is where we had barrack buildings that had 16 men to a room, to bunk, triple bunk style arrangement. In I should mention about the fact that the enlisted men that flew in combat had the rank of sergeant, and that was done on purpose because then the Geneva Convention would prevent them from doing any forced labor. If they were a private or something, they would be much lower. And of course, the German flyers were the cream of the crop, and they treated them with a great deal of deference, and they extended the same courtesy to us in the sense that they respected us more than they would other kinds of captives. And so there was a line there.
How long were you interned there, and was there any escape efforts, and how were you treated?
Yes.
And how would that compare to the treatment of enlisted people,
Yes.
and so on and so forth?
Yes. Good. The comments about our internment. Well, of course, I was in the camp from September 12th until actually the Russians overran the camp that we were in. That was on May the 1st. But the Germans were very meticulous and proper, and kept magnificent records. Matter of fact, I have my own prison record for you. And one of the things they did was they posted the names and the rank and the hometown of the newest crop of prisoners that are coming in. And lo and behold, comes Charlie Glasgow, first lieutenant, whose hometown was Berkeley, California. Well, I have to look after this fellow. I'll be his mentor, bring him in. Charlie, it turns out, was a West Point graduate. He had graduated from the military academy, got into pilot training, and they made him instructor. He was instructor for 18, 20 months before he got into combat. His classmates, in the meantime, had gone overseas, and they were now majors and lieutenant colonels, and he was still a first lieutenant. And now he was Air Corps, unassigned, in a POW camp. He was pissed. Let me tell you. But through him, I met some really interesting chaps, and I told you about the population explosion in this camp. They built another camp. By the way, the Battle of the Bulge took place December 16th, 1944. It was about the same time that they opened up this new compound. They called it North number 3. And the West Point regular Army guys ran the camp. The ranking officer, the ranking American and the British officer were in command of the place, regardless of what their background was. But the real camp was run by the academy guys, and they were top-notch people, of course. But when they opened up number 3, Charlie and one of his old friends, Captain Pace, were invited to be kind of chargé of the barrack that we moved into. And there was a room that just housed 4 people. And we were in that, we had a deluxe arrangement. We had a room about a third of the size of this facility was our room, and it was a double deck, and Pace had one of his friends, and I was Glasgow's chap, shall we say. And Stan Pace was later president of TRW, and later, even after that, at United Technologies. He was quite an interesting guy. But that experience was quite interesting, because they also, when they built this new barrack, they built rooms that held 24 men. And every room had its own organization. You had to organize your cooking and cleanups and all of the other things so that everybody took turns and went through this sort of thing. We had, up until the Battle of the Bulge, we got Red Cross parcels that were all, of course, paid for by the United States government. They were distributed by Red Cross through Switzerland. When the Battle of the Bulge occurred, the supply was cut off. We didn't get Red Cross parcels for several months after that. And so, but the parcels had been designed to supplement the diet that you would have, because they would expect that you would be getting potatoes and black bread and kohlrabies and whatnot. And so it came with the little cans of liver pate, clim, which is milk spelled backwards in powdered form, and cigarettes and chocolate bars. The cigarettes, I was one of the non-smokers, so I always contributed my cigarettes to the community fund. They used those to barter with the Germans for things that they wanted. Matter of fact, they were able to, through the barter system, they were able to construct radios in the various parts of the compound, and they would install them behind walls, and the way they would turn it on would be to connect the wires by putting the wires through the hole in the wall to connect the radio, and they'd get BBC broadcasts, and they published them in typewritten memos that were handed around in the compounds, and I'm not sure whether the Germans ever knew about it or not, but it was that was part of the program.
You mentioned that you were in officers' quarters that were better than what most people had. But what was the food like for you, and what was the heating situation? Because you're pretty far north in Germany, aren't you?
Yes. Well, yeah. The food that we had, as I mentioned earlier, was pretty much what the Germans had, and the only thing that was better were the Red Cross parcels. As I said, we didn't get Red Cross parcels from mid-December until about mid-March. And they resumed the Red Cross parcel activity because they were bringing them in from Sweden. And they had it turns that we discovered after the war was over that they had a warehouse practically full of Red Cross parcels that they hadn't passed out to us the way they should have. But there were many POWs in different parts of Germany that never did get Red Cross parcels, or got them very, very sparingly, maybe one package a month or something like that. And the weather, being a California boy, I couldn't imagine what it was going to be like in cold country like that. But somehow or other, it didn't seem to bother us too much. I think partly because the proximity to a major body of water has a tendency to sublimate or reduce the. In other words, we didn't have any particular amount of snow that I remember. We did have cold weather. We did, but we walked a lot. We walked around the camp. You know, there's a little pathway that went around.
Did you heat the barracks?
And to heat the barracks, yeah, we just had stoves in the room. And they gave you a couple of lumps of coal every once in a while, and that was how they kept the room warm. And that's what we cooked with too. In other words, the cooking activity was connected with heating the room. And I don't have a terribly good memory about that. But I remember walking. One of the chaps that I got friendly with was John Birkenheimer. He was from Michigan. He was a navigator flying out of the 8th Air Force in England. And he and I teamed up one time and drew a map of Europe on the wall. I forget where we got the materials, but crayons. And he knew the west and the northern part of Europe pretty well, and I knew the southern part of Europe pretty well. So we did it all from memory. We drew a map and put in names of all the places, and folks would stand around and look at the map, telling about missions they'd flown here and there, and the other thing was kind of a fun thing to do. One day, he and I were walking, and a man came out of one of the barracks, and he's carrying a big round of cheese. And he walking down there, and there's a garbage pits. I mean, he chunked this round of cheese into the dump. And John and I looked at each other. I mean, we scrambled down in that pit so fast it could make your head spin. Brought the lump of cheese. It was all covered with mold and all this crummy stuff. Just scrape it off, and you got beautiful protein coming at you. And we were heroes for that. One of those little things. But the enlisted men in the experience from the group that I know about, were in a place called Luft 4, which was at Groß-Tieschau, and that was quite a ways east of where we were. And when the Russians were approaching there, they decamped. They forced all of these 4,000 or 5,000 men out on the road for, I guess, the beginning of February, about February 4th or 5th. And they were actually literally forced marched out of there, and they never had a permanent place to camp or bed down until they were either caught up by the Russians or by the American and British forces at towards the middle or the end of April. Some of them didn't even weren't even recovered until after the 1st of May, when the war was officially, emphatically over. Actually, the actual war end was supposed to be on May the 8th, but it was taking place before and after that. And they lived excruciatingly difficult, terrible existence for those 100 days that they were on foot, and with cold weather and frost beat and frozen limbs and food that was almost non-existent. They had to pick up whatever they could find along the road. And I have the stories of many of those men. I have received from them their stories. The Russians overran the camp that we were in, and they wanted to tear down the barbed wire enclosure that we were in, the camp, and the American and British officers said, no, not yet to that, we don't want that. They wanted us to march to a little town close by and take a train to Stettin, and from Stettin go back to Odessa on the Mediterranean. And they said Nayet to that. The Americans didn't want any part of that. And they've been in contact with the 8th Air Force, trying to arrange to have aircraft come in. We were one of the only 2 camps that was evacuated by air. But ours was held up. There was a Russian general by the name of Vlasov, who was captured in 1942 by the Germans. And he had gone to the Germans and made a proposition that he would recruit Russian POWs, have them put on German uniforms and fight the Russians, which he did. And Stalin wanted this guy back bad. And we only learned this about 8 or 10 years ago. I'm sure somebody must have known about it earlier. But at any rate, we became pawns in this thing because when the Americans turned Vlasov over to the Russians, 2 hours later, B-17 started arriving at the airfield near where our camp was, and we evacuated that way. When we were evacuated out of the air base at Barth, they flew in B-17s and C-46s. C-46s were carrier planes, but the 17s they had outfitted with plyboard or something of the sort, so they could put 35 or 40 men in an airplane. I don't think they maybe got more than 35 in, but they were jammed in. If you ever been in a B-17, 35 people inside one of those is pretty tight squeeze. But of course, it wasn't that much of a haul because they just flew us back to as far as France, which couldn't have been more than a 90-minute or 2-hour flight. Those days, the top speed was roughly around 150 knots, 170 knots. So I forget how long that would have taken. Yeah, it took place over the 12th, 13th, and 14th of May, almost 2 weeks after the Russians had liberated us, so to speak, and then went back to. From there, we were taken back to what was called Camp Lucky Stark at Le Havre in North France. And we were there, depending on how long you were before you got out by boat, 3 or 4 or 5 weeks. People that knew what they were doing, could get up and sneak off to France and do their thing. But I was a young puppy that didn't know which end was up. And we did see Ike. He came through the camp one time and waved and said hello to everybody. I went back on the USS Butner to Newport News, Virginia, and that was a trip that took about a week, I guess, and it was not memorable at all. But I remember getting into Virginia, and I had the idea that I would like to visit. As long as I'm here, I might as well visit Washington, D.C. So I'm hitchhiking. And a man picked me up and wanted to know where I was going. I said, well, I was going to Washington, D.C. He said, I'll take care of that. So he drove me out to the north end of Richmond, turned me over to the fire department on the north end. This young man wants to go to D.C. See that he gets there. Well, they started hailing traffic, and when they found somebody that was going to Washington, D.C., they would take this young man with you. This was in the days when we did things a little bit different than we do nowadays. And it was, and then of course I had talked to my family by phone. I should have mentioned before that one of the things that happened when I was in the Dulag was that you could write a postcard to your family, and of course they could read whatever it was you wrote. But I learned later that they had broadcast it on shortwave, and ham operators up and down the East Coast had written down the message and my folks' address and sent it to my parents in Berkeley by mail. I mean, they mailed it, the message that I had sent to them, and that was the first they knew that I had been shot down and was still alive. It must have been a glowing message because they broadcast it on the shortwave. When I did get back to Berkeley, this was the early part of July of '45, and I was on 60-day leave. At the end of that time, I went to an R&R camp not a camp, but a resort in Santa Monica, the Del Mar Club, I think it was called, and we get the royal treatment there. Of course, I didn't have a wife or a girlfriend or anything like that. Some of the married fellows did, but meanwhile, I enrolled at the University of California in Berkeley, which was my longtime proposition anyway. And I was a student back in school even before my discharge became official. I got back at the university. I became a student. I was busy, starting a life, starting a family, having a career, and I didn't really think back about it very much. And I hadn't actually done anything until the early '90s when we did get in touch a little bit more, and then when we went. I persuaded the other guys to go with me to visit for the 50th commemoration, and I never had belonged to Veterans of Foreign Wars or anything like that. I had too much else going on in my life. I didn't really stop and think about it that much. But in the last dozen years, I've spent a lot of time at it. I was president of our bomb group association for 3 years, and the fellow who was supposed to succeed me tells me, well, he's got heart problems, heart issues. He can't do it. And I couldn't find anybody else to do it. So the new president that we just put in office this last January is Bonnie Helms, who's a judge in Houston. She was born, she was 34 days old when her father was killed in action in Italy. In other words, she never knew her father.
The judge, the woman, do you have a lot of second-generation people involved now with this association, with the reunions?
We've been focusing on that very heavily, trying to get second and third generation more involved. Matter of fact, our last reunion in Dayton was 110 people. 40 of them were veterans. The rest were family, spouses, nephews, nieces, grandchildren, and whatnot. And we're going to be doing it next week in Houston, and I expect it'll be probably even fewer veterans. There are over 400 in the association, but most of them can't or won't travel for those kind of things. I have to digress now to tell a story about my relationship with Bacha and his family, because I had given him my address and that sort of thing, and so we started corresponding. And as the years went by, he and his wife had 4 daughters, and one of the daughters was Marcella, and she had married the son of the doctor that met me that day and looked after me. And their young family, most of them have been here. We had Diana, the oldest child in that family, came to the United States at our invitation as an exchange student, a high school exchange student at high school in Denver. And then a couple of years later, her younger brother came, and he was sponsored by a Golden Rotary Club. This was our Rotary Club program. And myself, I had visited half a dozen times. The first time was in 1984. The wife and I were on our way to Birmingham, England for a Rotary convention in Birmingham, England. And we were planning on bringing our golf clubs with us. But then I got a message from Bacha, we'd been corresponding all this time, that 40 years before I involuntary come, this year I involuntary come, because they were going to have a commemoration. So we left our clubs behind and went to Czechoslovakia, behind the Iron Curtain. And those days, it was a much different world. The Velvet Curtain, of course, raised in 1989, and it turned it just, the whole place blossomed, you know. It's amazing to see the difference. We've been many times to visit there. They've been living with patients. I remember in '91 when I went back, they had a ceremony. We didn't realize it before we got there, but when they had a little ceremony, and they had reopened the museum that they had. They had this history of this little town was back from the year 710 or something like that, and they had all of this memorabilia, including World War II stuff, that they'd hidden away while the communists were there, and they got it out and restarted this museum, and it's a remarkable collection they have. A little off the track a bit, but
What I was getting at.
yeah, I know what you.
I was thinking more along the lines, were you pleased or proud to have served, and do you think you accomplished anything? Were you glad that you went into the service and did what you did?
Oh yeah. It was, yeah. I mean, we didn't think anything of it. I mean, it was just part of what you did. I didn't have any. I don't want to just disappoint you or anything, but I just felt that I was doing what everybody else was doing.